Well, I'm not finished yet, but when you see what I'm wearing, often the videos where I'm wearing the same thing are part of a set. And this is the first in a set. And two things. First of all, one might wonder why John Brinsmead might go to the trouble to travel to Sydney to talk to Pastor Parmenter. Well, you'd have to ask him, but we know one thing was that Bob came out against the investigative judgment in 1844. I've mentioned this before. And John was very angry. But even as far back as 1967, John was not happy with Des. I'm not clear why. Des's first wife, Gwen, went to stay with Lawrence Brinsmead and his wife, Verna, and Verna was an excellent nurse. Gwen had cancer, breast cancer, and she went up there to have some special treatment, not from the Brinsmeads, but they offered to put her up. And at the time, Paul was boarded with John Brinsmead. Paul is Des and Gwen's middle son. And Paul was down this week, and I told him what I was doing about recording my view of Glacier View. And Paul reminded me that John Brinsmead used to talk to Paul, who was only 10 or 11 at the time. He talked to him negatively about his father all the time and kept saying to him that he was wrong. Apart from that, John did a couple of things that were quite cruel to Paul. I'm not going to spell them out to save Paul's confidentiality, but Paul thought that John Brinsmead was a very strange man. Now, Paul has grown up to be one of the best men you might meet, a very superior human being. And I can tell you he's the best stepson anybody could want. I thought again of what that little family, Des, Gwen and their 3 children, went through before, during and after their mother's death. I've always thought that those who speak most often about perfectionism in this life are often the least sensitive to the sufferings of others. Des's enemies never thought for a minute what Des and his children had been through. They never thought of what their actions might do to Des's children, on top of all the other pain that they'd been through. The denomination has always been heavy on judgment and light on mercy. And I'm pointed to myself as I point a finger. We've all failed in this respect. And the second thing was the comment that Des gave me this week from Reinda Bruinsma, who is a scholar who lives in the Netherlands and writes a blog. And Des had gotten hold of a blog from 2016. And here's a comment of somebody who's quite sympathetic, was not at Glacier View, I think, but still wondering what else Des and I did to bring on the wrath of the brethren. Here's his comment. And he's saying this after reading a book about Mary Kay Silver and then the biography of Des by Milton Hook. Bruinsma, I must admit that I always had and have difficulty in getting excited about all kinds of theological controversies. I'm totally amazed about the ferocity with which many defend the truth. Through the years, I've gotten the impression that Adventism in Australia has been especially susceptible to fierce theological fights. Another problem. Des was Australian. That explains it all. He continues, perhaps the commotion about Ford should be in part explained against this general background. And I have in brackets, really? and perhaps also in the context of the simultaneous issues around Robert Brinsmead. And I comment, I would change issues to claims about Robert Brinsmead. And it seems perhaps Desmond Ford and his second wife Jill, you see I'm in there again, were at times too combative. My comments, what exactly did I do? I've already told you that none of the accusations that I know about were true. How exactly was I combative? The reality is that the brethren don't know and didn't know then how to handle women who had an opinion, who wrote, who spoke out on religious issues. And this should be clear from all the hoo-ha over women's ordination, a doctrine that's not in the Bible, even for men, and a doctrine borrowed from the, dare I say it, the Catholics. Now, reindeer is a deer, pun intended, D-E-A-R, but even he thinks there must have been more to Glacier view than doctrinal differences. And I think some of the scholars think this. We thought like Des did. It must have been his attitude. Bruinsma continues, however, all this in no way justifies the often vindictive and highly politicised way in which the Ford case was handled, and the endless political manoeuvring that ultimately cost his job and his ministerial credentials. The Ford story is a tragedy that has left a trail of deeply hurt victims who often not only lost their employment, but also their spiritual home and even their faith. And he says later, and this was what tickled Des and why he brought it to me, Desmond Ford is now an old man, but he continues to be active. He still has very strong ties with the church that rejected him. He is even today an author and speaker who inspires many Adventists with his gospel message of divine grace. It would be a great credit to the church if it found a way to rehabilitate him before his life comes to an end. Unfortunately, there are no signs that point in this direction, but Ford knows that in spite of everything that's happened, he is appreciated and even admired by many Adventists.